This is a beautiful but intricate geometric embroidery design using cross-stitching and traditional Tatreez techniques. This is the full design. I think it's been over 6 months of me working on this just because I can only do one little square at a time, but you can see it's kind of got like an illusion to it. It's sewn in these little squares, but then it's also got the diamond design. With the overview of the project, let's move on to the supplies needed to create this pattern. With every embroidery design, you need your thread, and I am using this dark pinkish red color. I know on camera it looks very red, but in person it's more of a maroon, but it's from DMC and it's not the full 6-strand, but it instead is the 3-strand. I just prefer that in my embroidery. I also have a pair of scissors and I use an embroidery needle. I have a variety of them. I have some that are longer, some that are shorter, some that are sharper, and some that are more dull. I opt for one that's a little bit more sharp because going through the waste canvas and the fabric is a lot of work on my hands. And speaking of waste canvas, I do want this to be on a fabric, so I have sewn the waste canvas onto that fabric, but waste canvas is essentially just a type of cloth that allows you to just remove it after your project is done. That way you're not seeing the grid pattern like you would with this Aida cloth. Both of them do have a grid pattern, however with the Aida cloth there's only certain amount of holes. With the waste canvas there are extra holes because it has double thread for each square. Now with the supplies discussed, let's move on to the pattern itself. I fell in love with this pattern because I saw it in one of Jordan Nasser's pieces, and on his website he does have a beginner's tutorial, and that's where I've gotten all of the steps from. So it looks like you would work it in one square at a time. However, you actually split them into 4 little squares. I also wanted to point out the stain. It was tea on the waste canvas a long time ago, so just ignore it. But for the little squares, each column kind of has its own way of being worked, and each of the 4 squares also has their own way. But to make it easier on me, since this is a larger piece, I do fold everything before I get started. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. It just makes it so you're not reaching over and the string gets caught in less things. I use binder clips to just hold everything in place. I think it does a really good job, and I move them around as I work in different quadrants of the piece. Now, a little bit more detail of how things are worked. This is what I meant by each of these squares is divided into 4 and each one is worked differently. I tend to work in columns because you'll see that these 2 squares end up having similar patterns, and working down a full column is a lot easier than working each of these squares individually. However, for the sake of this tutorial, I am just doing one full square. So let's start off the tutorial with that first top left square. For this top left square, I am going to be doing a stitch in every other stitch, and usually if you've already been working through the piece, it will follow the row above it. This is a new piece of thread, so I am just making sure to secure it before I move on. For this column, I will be working the first row different than the rest of the rows in the square just because it needs to be complete before you can move on, but the other rows will be worked in groups of 2. So I am just continuing the pattern of every other stitch, but I'm only doing that first 14 stitches just because, again, I'm working in quadrants. I know that traditionally you would probably go across the whole row, but I am self-taught and just using the resources on the internet, and I found working in smaller groups has worked better for me. Also, being self-taught, I don't know the terminology, so I'm going to do my best at describing them. I also kind of know only some of them in Arabic, so I will try to translate the ones I do know as well. Once I finish the half stitches, I'm just going to work my way back across all of the columns to just finish off the X's. There's nothing fancy going on in the first or the last rows. These usually are either you are skipping every other stitch or you're doing a complete stitch in every stitch. You'll never variate from that. But now as the pattern continues, it will start to evolve a little bit as you go, and each row will kind of have its own design. That being said, it takes me about 30 minutes per small square, and I definitely did not need a 2-hour tutorial, so I'm going to go ahead and establish the pattern and then do all of the middle work off camera. So that is the first row established. Now moving on to the second, we're actually going to skip the second row and move on to the third because we are going to work it after we have started the third row. So we are going to skip the second row because there are not that many stitches in it at first. It starts to build up later on. So by starting the third row first, then we can move on to the second one. So we're not creating a lot of noise in the back and wasting a lot of the thread. For row 3, we are going to do 3 stitches right next to each other in the first 3, and then after that we are going to do a stitch in every other stitch, just matching up the row 1. Once we connect row 2 into this one as well, it will start to create these little L shapes that you see on the nearby quadrants as well. So for the top left square, anytime it's an odd row, you're going to start off with that row's number of stitches right next to each other and then completing the rest of the row with every other stitch. For the even rows, we are going to complete them as we are coming back, finishing the odd row below them. We will complete the last stitch in that chain of 3 and then move up to the second row. It's going to be 2 stitches above the complete stitching, the ones where we did those 3 right next to each other. It's going to be 2 stitches in the last 2 of that pattern. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to do the half stitch for those 2, and then I'm going to complete the row with every other stitch, just following the pattern of the rows above and below it. I'm going to go across the full row, just adding all of the half stitches, and then work my way back to the left and add in the remaining stitches to complete them all. I have now completed row 2, and I'm going to move back down to complete row 3. To do that, I am just going to fill in the first and the second stitches. I am making sure to work them 2, then 1, working from right to left. That way I am back in the first column and ready for the next row. Now that the first 3 rows are complete, you can start to see that L shape is starting to form, and you can see that those 2 stitches from the even rows kind of sits in the last 2 stitches of that complete chain from the odd row below it. Now following the pattern, moving on to the 5th row, I am going to sew 5 half stitches, and they are going to be right next to each other, and then they are going to line up with that 5th column. Because of that, it kind of is like a little marker of where to stop, and then I will move on to finishing the every other stitch in the columns after that. Once I've completed the every other stitch and made my way back to the 5th column, I am then going to add that 5th column stitch and then move up to the 4th row. Again, for the even rows, I am just going to put 2 stitches in the last 2 stitches of the odd row below it. So for this one, I am putting a stitch in the 4th and 5th column. After that, I will follow the every other stitch pattern for the remaining columns. Once I've completed the every other stitch of the 4th row, I am then going to move back and complete the 2 that were right next to each other, and then move down to the 5th row and then complete the 4th, 3rd, 2nd, then 1st stitches. So now we've established the top left quadrants pattern. For the first row, we're going to do a single stitch in every other stitch, doing half stitches across from left to right, then completing the stitches from right to left. The remaining rows are worked in groupings of even and odd, so we'll skip the even, move down to the odd one. We'll then do that row's number of stitches right next to each other. We'll do half stitches. So for example, for row 3, we'll do 3 half stitches right next to each other. And then for the remaining columns, we'll do a stitch in every other column. We'll then work from right to left to complete all of them up to that row numbers column. In the odd row, we will complete that stitch, but then move up to the even row to the stitch before that. So if it's column 3, we'll move to column 2. We'll do a stitch in that one and then a stitch in the column 3. And then we'll do every other stitch. We'll work from left to right to add the half stitches, then right to left to complete that row. And then we'll move back down to the odd row and complete it. And then we'll just repeat that pattern to complete the whole quadrant. So right now I'm working row 7. I did 7 half stitches and then a stitch in every other column. I am working from right to left to finish the every other column, stopping at column 7, moving up to the 6th row, adding the stitch in column 6 and column 7, working the every other stitch, then working from right to left to complete row 6, then moving back down to row 7 to complete it as well. So now I've completed that 7th row. I'm going to do the rest off camera and then come back for the last row so I can work those last 2 and move on to the bottom left quadrant. So for the last 2 rows, we're just going to work the pattern the same. It's just going to look a little different because for the last row, we'll be doing a stitch in every single stitch. I went ahead and completed those half stitches off camera, but once they are complete, we're then going to do the stitch in the last column for the odd row, and then move up to the even row where we will do the 2 stitches in the last 2 columns, and it will just kind of connect the whole piece together. But after I do those last 2 stitches, I'm going to work them from left to right, then right to left to complete them, and then I will move back down and complete the entire last row. This is what the piece is looking like all complete. The top left quadrant is now done, so let's move on to the bottom left quadrant. So to start the bottom left quadrant, it's a little bit different than the other one. For the first top left one, we did a stitch in every other stitch. However, we are going to match the pattern of the last row of the quadrant above it. So we are going to do a stitch in every single stitch. So I'm going to work half stitches from left to right, then complete them from right to left. So now we've got those 13 stitches, and we are going to move to the repeating portion of this quadrant. So we're going to skip that even row again and move down to the odd one. So we're moving down to row 3, but this time we're not going to do 3 complete stitches right next to each other in the beginning. We're actually going to do 11. We're kind of mirroring the pattern from the top left quadrant. So it'll go 13, then 11, then 9, then 7, and so on and so forth for the odd rows. Another way to look at it is for the third row, we are going to end the complete chain of stitches, the ones that are right next to each other, in the third to last column. And for the fifth one, we will end in the fifth to last column, and so on and so forth. But similar to the first quadrant, we will still be doing every other stitch for the remaining columns. So for the third row, we only have one individual stitch that's by itself in the last column. So we've started working that third row. We've gone from left to right doing the half stitches. I have moved from right to left with that individual stitch right there. But before I continue the remainder of that third row, I'm going to move up into the second one. With the first quadrant, we actually completed that last stitch, but for this one, we're not going to complete the last stitch. We're just going to move up immediately to the second row and then complete the 2 stitches, and these 2 stitches will line up with the empty column that is after the continuous chain of complete stitches. After working the 2 stitches in row 2, I'm then going to move down to row 3 and just complete the continuous chain in row 3. Once that is complete, we can now move on to row 4/5. So for the bottom left quadrant, the pattern starts out with a single stitch in every single stitch for row 1, and then we are going to do a repeating pattern for the next rows. We are grouping the evens and odds together, and we will skip the even row, then move into the odd one, and its number of stitches for the beginning continuous chain is 2 less than the odd row above it. Now we're working half stitches, we're working from left to right. We're also going to start adding in those stitches in every other column, and they're going to be in the odd columns. So if you end on the 9th, you will skip the 10th column and then add a stitch in the 11th. Then we're going to continue working from right to left to complete those individual stitches, and then once we get up to that chain of continuous stitches, then we'll move up to the even row above it and then add 2 stitches right in the even column after that continuous chain. So it'll be the even column and then the odd column after that. The even rows will also need the every other stitch, and it will just follow the columns of the odd row below it. So after adding those half stitches, we'll then work from right to left to complete the even row, then move back down to the odd row and complete that chain as well. This pattern works for all of the rows after that, including the last one. However, the last one does look a little weird, so I do want to walk through it, but you can see this one is just going to be a stitch in every other stitch, so the odd columns. So I'm working from left to right to do the half stitches, and then I'm going to work from right to left to complete them. However, I do need to stop right before that last stitch so I can move back up to the even row and complete that one with its 2 stitches in that even and odd column, and then also the every other stitch in those odd columns as well. Once I have added those 2 stitches and then also the half stitches for the every other column, I will work from right to left to complete the entire even row, and then I will move back down to complete that last stitch in the odd row. It's only 1 stitch this time, however, it is the last one of this quadrant, and that is what this one is looking like. Now let's move on to the top right quadrant. So the right hand side actually works a little bit differently than the left in that we don't actually work the rows in groupings. We actually go down in individual rows, and we will start off with the same design as the top left, by doing a stitch in every other stitch. The other thing to point out is that because this is a mirror of the left hand side, we're actually going to start with the every other stitch part of the rows first before moving on to the intricate pattern. So for row 1, we did a stitch in every other stitch, and we're going to follow that for the beginning of row 2. I'm doing a stitch in every other stitch. I'm going to get to column 11, do a stitch in that one, but then also a stitch in column 12. So we've done the half stitches from left to right, and now I will just work that row number 2 from right to left to then finish off all of the cross stitches. With row 2 complete, we can now move on to row 3, where we're going to start with a stitch in every stitch up until column number 11 again, and this time with column number 11 we are going to work a stitch in every stitch of 11, 12, and 13 to make that L shape. And same as before, we worked from left to right for those half stitches, and now in the same row we're going to work from right to left to make them complete stitches, and no need to go to any other row, just straight across row 3. And for the sake of time, I went ahead and did the remaining rows besides the last 2 off camera, and now I'm back for those last 2, and I did 2 stitches in that second to last row. It's just 1 in the first, 1 in the second, working from left to right, right to left to complete them. And then for the last row, it's just a single stitch in every single stitch. You do the half stitches from left to right, then you complete them from right to left. For the top right quadrants pattern, we start off with the first row is just a single stitch in every other stitch. Now each row is worked individually, however an even and an odd row are kind of connected to the same column. Even row will work that column and the stitch after it to make those double stitches, and then the odd row will use that column as the beginning guide on where to start the chain of stitches in every single stitch all the way to the right side. And as you're working down these rows, you'll start to move over left 1 column for each one of these groupings. But with that, let's move on to the last quadrant. For the bottom right quadrant, we are going to start off with a single stitch in every single stitch, working the half stitches from left to right, then completing the row from right to left. Now the next row is very simple. It is just 1 stitch in the first, 1 stitch in the second, and you just work from left to right to do the half stitches, right to left to complete them. Now the next row is where things get a little more complicated. We are going to start to incorporate the every other stitch. So we're going to start off with an individual stitch in the first column, and then we're going to skip the next, and then we are going to go in and start working the chain of stitches in every single stitch. Like before, we are going to work the complete row all together, so I'm going to work from left to right to add the half stitches, right to left to finish them. Now to complicate it a little bit more, for row 4 we are going to also start to accommodate the every other stitch into the even rows, so I'm going to do that first stitch in the first column, then I'm going to skip over the second one, and then I'm going to do 2 stitches, 1 in the next column, which is the third, and then also the fourth. Again, using half stitches from left to right, completing them from right to left. Now for the bottom right quadrant pattern, we are going to be working these in groupings. However, each row will be completed individually. The first grouping is the first and second row. The first one will just be a complete row of single stitches in every single stitch. The second one will be following that first column, where we're going to put a stitch in the first 2 columns. Now for the rest of the rows, we are just going to start to add in those every other stitches at the beginning. So for the rows 3 and 4, we'll add 1 at the beginning, and then we'll have the start of the continuous chain at column 3. Then for row 4, it will have that stitch in the beginning, skip the second column, and then do the 2 stitches in columns 3 and 4. We will continue that pattern for the remaining rows, but we'll just move over 2 columns every single time. So we started at 1, we moved over to 3, we'll move over to 5, and we'll continue until we've run out of rows. Unlike before, I want to just go through the last 2 rows since sometimes they're a little bit trickier, but for this one it's pretty simple. The last row, I'll start with the every other stitches. I'll do that for pretty much all of the columns up until the second last odd column. I will then do my 2 stitches there, and then I will just work my way backwards to just complete all of the half stitches. With all of those stitches complete, we can then move on to the final row, which is just going to be a stitch in every other stitch, working from left to right to complete the half, then from right to left to make the complete cross stitches. And with that, we have completed a full square of this pattern. This is what it is looking like all complete. I think it is a beautiful pattern, which is why I've dedicated the last 6 months and probably another 6 more to this beautiful piece. So I'm off to work on it now.